Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm speaking to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where it is partly cloudy and in the 70s. It's a very nice day. And we are so happy to have with us a panel of experts on key factors for advancing voluntary conservation in Latin America. This is a subject that has long been an interest of the International Land Conservation Network and its organizers. We're so glad that Hernan and Zach are doing such a great job bringing us forward on this subject. So with no further ado, let me introduce Hernan Mladinish, who will introduce to you our panelists for today. Hernan?
Thank you, Jim. Well, good morning, good afternoon to everyone in Latin America and around the globe. Welcome to our webinar, Key Factors for Advancing Voluntary Conservation in Latin America. This is our fourth webinar of a series that started in December 1st last year as part of the International Land Conservation Network initiative dedicated to connecting organizations and people around the world who are developing voluntary land conservation actions in the private sector and civil society. Our efforts have been focused this year on strengthening the private and voluntary land conservation network in the Latin America region through the exchange of knowledge, experiences, and exemplary practices in four areas of work: conservation, finance, policy and law, organization and governance, and stewardship. This year, ILCN is celebrating its 10th anniversary, and we have verified along this time private land conservation is a growing field of practice which is increasingly being recognized for its contribution to realizing positive environmental and social outcomes at scale. Latin America has a long history of voluntary private land conservation and has made significant advancements in recent years, with at least 5.3 million hectares of protected areas and over 5,000 private reserves. However, there is a need to better understand policies, tools, and strategies that support landowners in advancing their voluntary conservation initiatives across the region. This webinar will bring together four panelists to share insights on the enabling conditions in their countries. To address these issues, we have a panel of four guests. Mark Thurber, which is president of the Andean Cloud Forest Foundation and co-owner of the Alto Coca Reserve and manager of Walsh, Ecuador. Mimi Foyle, the vice president of the National Corporation of Forests and Private Reserves of Ecuador, which is the national association or network of private protected areas in Ecuador. Eduardo del Valle, president of the board of directors of Res Natur, which is the Colombian network association of natural reserves of civil society, and Anne McInerney, senior program officer at the Alumbra Innovations Foundation in Baja California Sur in Mexico. Our first guests are going to do a presentation as representatives of Ecuador is Mark Thurber and Mimi Foyle. Mark Thurber is, as I mentioned, is the president of the Andean Cloud Forest Foundation, and is the co-owner of the Alto Coca Reserve, an ecotourism project located deep inside the roadless wilderness of Ecuador, at the headwaters of the Amazon basin in the foothills of the Andes. A project he started in 2001, while being a guidebook author of Ecuador Climbing and Hiking Guide, along mountain guide Peter Ayarza to conserve a unique and threatened ecosystem. Mark is also a manager of Walsh, Ecuador, a social environmental consulting firm founded in 1995, which provides services in Ecuador and the world. The other guest is Mimi Foyle. She's the vice president of the National Association of Forests and Private Reserves Ecuador. She has been in Ecuador for 36 years. She owns and manages Reserva Rio Huaycuyacu, a 31 hectares family farm at the junction of two rivers in the rainforested foothills of northwestern Ecuador, about 80 kilometers to northwest of Quito. Half forests and about 9 hectares of food forest with 500 species of fruit trees from all over the tropical world. seeds that she markets. Not to count the rich biodiversity of animals, birds, and plants. Mimi was a founding member of the network of Ecuador Network of Forests and Private Reserves in 1996 and have been active in the organizations ever since. So Mark and Mimi, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be part of this seminar. And Mimi and I are going to talk about land conservation in Ecuador, and then focus in on voluntary land efforts here. Since the early 1990s, there's been a tremendous effort to conserve land, and a lot of that has gone into national protected areas. But parallelly, there are many actors that have been involved in voluntary land conservation to strengthen those efforts by the national government, and also to bridge areas that are separated, and also fill in areas that don't have conservation status. We're going to talk about review the National Protected Area System, talk about the international conservation designations, and then dive into the voluntary reserves. I guess I want to start out by saying that the voluntary actors are really the neglected orphans of the conservation efforts here. And many of us are kind of working with limited resources and kind of lack coordination between ourselves in Ecuador and also internationally. And so this effort to bring some unity to our efforts and coordination and sharing experience, I think, is very, very, very important to promote conservation in Ecuador. So I'll start out by showing you a map of Ecuador, which has the federally or nationally protected areas. You can see that Galapagos is a big marine reserve. You have marine and terrestrial reserves on the coast, and then you've got reserves in the highlands, and then you have some reserves in the Amazon part of the country. You can see, like in many countries, you have these reserves that have gaps between them, and many of the private efforts are either on the edges of these reserves or between these gaps to promote conductivity and also protect the reserves, because historically they haven't had a lot of resources, and there have been various problems of impacts from other actors. So Ecuador, small country about the size of the state of Oregon, and we do have 23% of the country in protected areas, which is very high. We also have other categories, intangible zones, which are areas where you can't do extractive resources. In some of our protected areas, they allow mining and oil development. We also have protection of waterways, and we have corridors. We also have the local government is able to put areas into this system, SNAP, Sistema Nacional de Áreas Protegidas, National Protected Area System. That's just starting, and there's some municipalities that have done that, like Quito and Cuenca. And I want to show you an interactive map that the Ministry of Environment has that kind of shows you the different layers of protection, and including some of the voluntary efforts, private efforts. So let me switch over. Okay, so this is a map that shows all the different categories of protection, and it's got SNAP, it's got patrimonial forests, bosque protectores or protected forests, biosphere reserves, Ramsar areas, water protection areas, intangible zones or no-go zones, corridors of connectivity, etc. And if I turn some of these, see if I can turn some of these off. I'm turning them on right now. You can see that almost half of the country has some kind of protected status. And some of these, like Bosque Protectors, are in the private status. But we have a lot of the country that's on a map in a protected area. But the private landowners that are around these reserves, between these reserves, are very important in terms of strengthening this whole protected system. Go back to so I'll let Mimi take over here. These are some of the international conservation designations that we have in Ecuador.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah, there's the United Nations has biosphere reserves, which are areas that have people living within them, but they also have significant amounts of native habitat. Global hotspots, two of the something like 36 global hotspots of biodiversity in the world, which also have they have a lot of endemism, which is why they're hotspots of biodiversity, but they are also very strongly threatened to disappear. So they're important for that reason. And Ecuador has the two that we have are the Andes tropicales and the Tumbes Chocó Magdalena, which also goes, well, the Andes tropicales goes all the way to Argentina, I think. Maybe. and the other goes pretty much from the south in Peru up to Colombia. And the KBAs, the key biodiversity areas, they're all over the country because Ecuador has got a lot of different areas of biodiversity because of the mountains, the coast. The mountains are really folded up, and so they create little pockets of habitat for different animals, but they don't, in fact, and plants, which don't then cross over the mountains and get on the other side. So there's just heaps of little pockets of stuff. And these key biodiversity areas have been, I think, researched into by the, well, by Critical Ecosystem Corporation or Foundation, and they work with local NGOs to record the biodiversity of different areas and then do fund projects which are going to help protect them. The IBAs are important bird areas. That's through an international organization of birds, BirdLife International. Ramsar is a convention about wetlands, which is, I think, also somehow related to the United Nations. And there are 18 of these. They are to keep the wetlands viable because the wetlands are really important for migratory birds and for other animals. And then the OMEX, which is somewhat recent in Ecuador. Those are otros medios de efectivos de conservación, effective conservation areas, and they're defined by geographically defined areas. And it's just started in Ecuador. Last December was when they approved their normativa, their law about it. And so there aren't any of them actually. But one of the things about them is that you can recognize an area as being important for biodiversity, but you can't protect it. If you join the SNAP, the national system, that's protection. But if you are anywhere outside of the SNAP, you are still subject to things like mining concessions that get put on your land. So even though you're trying to protect things, you can only protect what's above the ground and not what's under, What's under belongs to the government. And if they decide to clap a mining concession on it or petroleum, that's it. So, and they're based on areas. So that's those. And we're going to change to the next one. Mark, are you doing that?
I can start out and then you can jump in.
Oh, okay.
So in terms of voluntary reserves,
Oh, I see.
there's several categories that we have. One, which started up maybe 10 years ago, correct me if I'm wrong, Mimi, but Socio Bosque, and it's a very large program that basically rewards landowners for maintaining habitat. And there's currently 1.7 million hectares in that system, and there's 120,000 beneficiaries. One of the things that is difficult about this, there's a payment that is transferred to the landowners or communities, but Socio Bosque has been excluded from any of the carbon schemes or ecosystem service schemes. And so basically, this is the way that people are rewarded for those types of commitments, but it goes through the government. And that's different than other countries where they're developing markets for carbon and also ecosystem services. But it's a very large area of the country, 1.7 million hectares. An older program is Bosque Protectores, which are basically private reserves. And I think that program was started in the 90s. And a very large percentage of Ecuador is also 9% is within that system. There's also a new system that came out about 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, which are private reserves, which are within the National Protected Area system. So they're basically national parks that are privately owned. And the benefit of people putting land voluntarily into the system is that they're part of the Ministry of Environment's management system, and there are also restrictions about mining. There's access to research funds. There's access to, I would say, security resources in case you have an invasion, settlers, squatters coming on your land. And so very few of the reserves have gone into that because it's fairly bureaucratic, but we're kind of experimenting with that. And then we already mentioned areas of conservation, areas of conservation and sustainable use. I'll let Mimi talk about that. But then the final category is private informal reserves. So there are quite a few individuals or communities that are conserving areas, and they're not under any kind of designation, and they're not coordinating with other actors. And there's about 9.5 million hectares of remnant natural habitation in Ecuador in the continental part. That's about 40% of the total. And nearly 40% of that is titled to or in private hands. So voluntary conservation efforts are very important in terms of conserving that 40%. Maybe do you want to talk about ACOS? Yeah.
Okay. The áreas de conservación y sustainable use are areas that are declared by the local governments, which would be the provincial government or the cantones, the county governments, and even people's parishes can determine an area they're going to use. It has people living in it and having their businesses in it, but it has a substantial amount of forest and area to conserve or for water and other ecosystem services. So they declare these ACUSs. Some of them are part of those local governments' subsystems to the SNAP. The SNAP is really made up of 4 different subsystems, and only one of them is the state. And then there's these local governments, and then there are communities, and then there are the private reserves. But there are only 2 communities in the SNAP. So they're still kind of beginning to get adjusted to letting other people in to the very protected status. All of these other areas then really don't have the protection that they could have but that's just it. In terms of the private informal reserves, actually some ONGs also have preserved hundreds of thousands of hectares, but most of the private informal reserves are tucked away in the little pockets. They're sort of like islands in a sea of other land uses. But because there are 40% of the total of the wild lands, a lot of them are in that 40%, and the ones that aren't could be. So there is great potential there for land conservation. Our own organization, the Red de Bosques, has maybe 66, 68 members and conserve almost 80,000 hectares of land for conservation. So it's really good. What we're looking to do is, we've existed since 1996. Yeah, we have a legal framework because it makes it easier for you to function. If you're a legal entity, then you can negotiate, make cooperation agreements with universities and other ONGs, and it just makes it easier. So with it, I don't know, you're supposed to be able to get tax benefits, but those actually belong to the counties, and the counties do not always give them to you. So the legal framework basically is to have a national organization to cover a lot of small people's interests, because they don't really pay attention to someone who has half a hectare or even 10 or 30 or 50. They really want more hectares to be dealing with. So as a national organization, we can represent those people and try and push for benefits for all of them. There are many, many private reserves, and some of them are organized like us. There are others that belong to ONGs, NGOs. They belong to NGOs. Some of the NGOs will have 15 or 18, and others will have only a single reserve, but they have a large number of private reserves and many hectares that they're protecting. Many of the ones that belong to NGOs are using the land for conservation independently, scientific and others. The private reserves that have land for doing ecotourism are able to then be financially sustainable from that practice. Then international support is indeed really key for strengthening our Red de Bosques and everyone's. Many of the individual reserves need technical and administrative capacity that they don't have. They have not very many, or they're doing a passive kind of conservation. So it's really good through our organization, they have access then to other funds and other projects and things that help them. Some of the challenges, a lack of coordination, a lack of many of the reserves that are operating on their own. They compete for funding. They don't share their knowledge within the organization. They're just quiet. Some of them are just not really communicative. Many people who have private reserves are very independent, and they are not very communicative. And they also live far out. They don't necessarily have internet coverage, so they're not clued into the whole. It's been a lack of government engagement and support. The government has been focusing on SNAP and indigenous lands, yes, for one thing. But for another, there have been consistently other interests involved, and the government pays more attention to those other interests than they do to environment. For all that the Constitution supports environmental things, but the government does not always enact what's in the law. And then we do not have particularly financially sustainable. Almost half of our members are not financially sustainable. The reserves are not financially sustainable on their own, and they have another job or something to cover their expenses. And succession spans. Many of us are not growing young. We're growing older, and there have to be people to continue to do it. Conservation is an ongoing thing for many generations if we do it right. So land conservation is super important. And people who own the land are usually conscientious up to a point, but if their families don't go along with it, then it's not going to continue in the family. Many people are finding it's a struggle as their own parents grow older. Some of them are foreigners who live in other countries. So there's no clear succession. So it's something we need to work on.
So this is the last slide, and I'll just summarize, what we think the path forward is for private efforts, voluntary efforts. One is to strengthen the coordination between the reserves or the voluntary efforts through national associations like the one that Mimi has been involved in since the 1990s, and other NGOs and other national actors need to provide support to these voluntary efforts, especially the smaller, poorly funded reserves. As Mimi has pointed out, there are quite a few that are maybe 10 to 50 hectares and really dedicated to it, but they're oftentimes an individual family and they don't have good succession plans, and they're dependent on tourism or other unstable sources. We think it's very important regional coordination with ILCN and other national, international organizations, so that we can share knowledge, resources, and advocate with the government for resources and good policies that help our efforts. We want to improve the relationship with Ecuadorian government, technical and financial support. There's really been a break. There's a lot of money that comes in Ecuador for conservation efforts, and most of it, as Mimi pointed out, goes to the SNAP or the National Protected Area System or local governments or indigenous reserves. So private landowners are kind of as I said, the neglected orphan in this, even though we're spending a lot of efforts and personal resources to conserve important areas. Another important point is that there is an international donor community that supports various private reserves, but it's very siloed, in my opinion, to particular projects. A lot of it goes to SNAP, and it needs to go to, some of those resources need to be funneled through a national organization so that we can support these smaller reserves and also develop standards and sharing knowledge and all of that. And so you get reserves that are well-funded for 10 or 15 years, and then the funding dries up and that reserve has expanded and there's a lot of trouble. And I think to mitigate some of those problems, we need to strengthen a national organization that can, through international donor efforts. Sorry, lost that. And then also explore various trust mechanisms and other financial tools to help reserves in their sustainability, so they're not dependent on yearly budgets, but they have an income from a trust. So I'll end it on that.
Okay, thanks, Mimi and Mark, for that informative presentation that reveals, the challenges and opportunities in Ecuador, not very different from what other countries in the region are experiencing. Our next guest is Eduardo del Valle. Eduardo is a lawyer specializing in environmental law, founder of the Agua Dulce Natural Reserve and the El Trópico Natural Reserve, both established as Habitat Bank in Colombia, an alternative to materialize effective compensation schemes that facilitate ecosystem restoration processes and maintenance of ecosystem services. Eduardo is presently the president of the board of directors of Resnatur, the Colombian Network Association of Natural Reserves of Civil Society. Established in 1992, Resnatur has been promoting within the framework of the National System Protected Areas the recognition of private conservation as a complement to the efforts of public institutions for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Eduardo, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen so you can see the presentation that we have prepared. Okay, so Resnatur is as Hernan said, it was founded 30 years ago, 32 years ago. Is the National Association of Natural Reserves of Civil Society. We have presence in different municipalities in Colombia. In Colombia are more than 1,000 municipalities. We have presence in 97 municipalities of the country. We are divided also in 32 departments, like states, but we are not like a federal government. And we have presence in 25 departments in Colombia. In total, we are 187 natural reserves. Taking into account that we are just an association of natural reserves, but there are more natural reserves that are no part of Resnatur. Resnatur is like the bigger association. However, before the National Parks System and before the National Parks Authority, which is the one that is in charge of managing the different protected areas, there are 1,800 natural reserves in Colombia, which are all our private properties and private exercises of natural conservation. We have more than 79,000 hectares. We have presence in the different ecosystems of the country. And of the 187 87 natural reserves that we have in Resnatur, all of them are natural reserves, but between us, we have also some differences. Some of these differences are that some of these are OMEX, which is one that they were talking about the Ecuador case. We have also here OMEX. So in Colombia, we can have a natural reserve that is not registered before the government as a natural reserve, but is registered as an OMEC, which is an alternative mechanisms of conservation. But also we have natural reserves that are registered before Resnatur as an association, but are not registered before the national government. And there are other natural reserves that are part of Resnatur and also are part of the national protected area systems as a natural reserve registered before the ministry. But also, as Hernan was saying, there are some another kind of structure, which are the habitat banks, in which is not a protected area, but is like a financial mechanisms, which includes the management of the lands in order to protect and to protect biodiversity. So according to our regulation, you can be a natural reserve registered before the national government, and at the same time, you can be a habitat bank. The fact that if your project is registered not only as a natural reserve, but also as a habitat banks, it means that you can receive resources from the voluntary market and also from the mandatory market. We have been working on the issuance of biodiversity credits, and under these biodiversity credits, it works with the habitat banks in terms of 1 hectare is 1 credit, and if there is a company that has an environmental compensation obligation or forced environmental investments that are also mandatory in some projects that require environmental license, the habitat banks can receive these resources. So as you can see, we have 187 natural reserves, but between us, we have different models on how to manage the private properties in order to protect biodiversity. Now I want to share some information, which are the challenges that we have been analyzing in Resnatur. Actually, in 2011, there was a study that was held by Marcela Santamaria, Estefania Garcia, and other people that are part of Resnatur, which I have here the reference if you want to see more about that information. Pablo Jaramillo, Natalia Ortiz, Alejandro Florian in 2011, with some of the information that they received from some natural reserves in Antioquia and in other parts of the country. From that study and from the other things that we have reviewing, we have found 7 main challenges that we are suffering here and that we have to deal with it, which is not very far from what we just heard from the Ecuador case. It means that we are sharing problems, but at the same time, it means that we can share solutions for these kind of things. So the first thing is that we don't have like a public policy in Colombia that makes and creates incentives for the conservation. In other terms, we have a property tax, which we have to pay every year to the municipalities. And from a municipality point of view and from the state point of view, each property has to pay the same, even though if you are conserving, or if you have cows, or if you have agriculture or industrial agriculture, no matter which is the kind of activities that you are undertaking in your property, you have to pay the same property tax. So at the same time, this makes it puts a lot of pressure on the owners of the properties, because at the end of the day, they have to work and to make the property is going to make the resources in order to not only to pay the current things that you need in your conservation project, but also you have to pay to the government for the land tax, so on the property tax. So this is one thing that we think we have to work on it, because at the end of the day, if you are making and putting pressure on the properties and you have to pay the same, even though you are making conservation, restoration, or you are making other kind of commercial or industrial activities, at the end of the day, if you are not receiving money for the conservation, then you are in an unequal position between other landowners, and this makes make pressure on the natural resources in order to use them to have more area in order to make the money to pay the tax. So this is one thing that we think that we have to work on it, and is to try to get an amendment of the regulation to work together with the government. So there is a difference between the people that has natural reserves and protected areas registered before the government, or even not registered but before the government, but they are providing natural services and ecosystem services, so they don't have to pay the same. Because if you make that difference, then you going to make an incentive, so more people is going to protect biodiversity and our forests and different ecosystems that we have. This is one challenge. The other challenge that we have is related, and is the competence that we are seeing between the people that is conserving areas and the people that is between and surrounding these areas, and there are trying to fight for the natural resources. In other terms, from water, from forests, from different natural resources. So if there is not a national environmental policy that is trying to align everyone in order to make together joint efforts in order to conserve and to protect biodiversity, then we are going to have some issues. This is part of what we have to discuss in October here in the COP in Colombia, which is going to take place here in Cali. So it's how to make justice in terms of if people is protecting areas, indigenous communities, Afro-Colombians, or private properties, private owners. At the end of the day, we need to have the resources and the tools to avoid making this pressure on the natural resources. The other challenge that we have is the time it's taking the national government to register natural reserves. That's very important, because if you are an owner, or if you are an NGO that wants to promote conservation, or even a company or a bank or any kind of people that may be, or company or entity that wants to create value from the biodiversity point of view, if the first problem that you have is that the government is to take 1 or 2 years to register your area, then you are going to lose maybe some of the interest that you may have on your own project. It does not mean that you have to be registered before the government. I want to make that clearance. You can have a natural reserve that is some of what we have here in Resnatur, and they are only located and associated to Resnatur and not registered before the government. But at the end of the day, if you want to have a voice before the government, and it is not only the national, but also the local government, then you have to be registered. If you want to be called from the government to attend the meetings in order to make decisions on your territory, how to deal with natural resources, which areas are going to be protected, which may also make connections to your protected areas, then you have to be registered. And if that administrative procedure takes 1 or 2 years, then you are not going to have the incentive to go and promote to the creation of more natural reserves. So that's another challenge that we have, and it's a challenge that the only person that can solve that problem is the government, because at the end of the day, they have the resources to receive the papers, make the visits, issue the technical reports, and at the end to make a decision in order to decide whether or not you are going to register an area. This is another important thing, is that from the natural reserves that are registered before the government, there is not a minimum area. So you can register 1 hectare to 100,000 hectares, whatever you want. So at the end, the exercise from the government point of view is the same, no matter which is the size of the property. So that's why some of the idea that we can explore is how to make a difference depending on which is the size of the area, because at the end of the day, the government may put more interest on big areas, but also the small one, because every counts. From biodiversity protection and conservation, every single effort counts. The other thing that we have is also thing related with tax law. At the end of the day, makes decisions, and is that we have to pay VAT, 90% VAT for each service or good that we need in order to implement our environmental management plans in our projects. So at the end, if you want to protect biodiversity conservation projects, you have to make some differences between which is the tools, services, on goods that people requires for the implementation on the habitat banks or natural reserves or OMEX or whatever is the name of the environmental conservation project. You need to have a difference on how you can get a reduce from the VAT, or you can have a different treatment by the government from your tax point of view, because at the end of the day, if you have to pay the same 90% of VAT for the acquisition of goods or services that you require for your your baseline, or for your monitoring or your reports or whatever is required, then you are not making the same. You are not in an equal position between a conservation project and a commercial industrial project. The other issue and challenge that we have found is that there is we have having regulations, environmental regulations, since 5 centuries. I mean, but the current regulation that we have, which regulates the relationship between people and natural resources, is almost brand new. This year we are celebrating the 50-year of the Natural Resources Code, and which was issued in 1974, and in 1993, after the Rio Declaration in 92, we issue our National Environmental Institutional Law, which is the Law 99 of 1993. In this regulation, it's regulated, under this regulation is regulated what we call the environmental compensations, but also what is called the forced investment, which is the 1%. It means that if you need, if you are undertaking a project work or activity that requires an environmental license, and that environmental license includes a water concession, and you use the water, then you have to pay the 1% of the value of the project work or activity that is covered under the environmental license, in order to implement actions to protect water and natural resources. What we have seen is that even though the different governments that we have in these 30 years have implemented different environmental compensation regulations, we have seen from the environmental point of view, from the conservation projects, that we need to update our regulation. The other fact that is related to this point is that we have 2 different kinds of regulations. We have the national one, and we have the local regulation, which is issued by the local governments, the local environmental authorities. So we have a national environmental compensation regulation, but also depending on where is your project, you may require a specific local environmental compensation. So it's very hard to try to, from a state point of view, to implement a national policy conservation, compensation environmental policy if you have different levels of decision making on how to deal with the use of natural resources. The other thing that we have is the lack of coordination, which is also a point that was raised by the Ecuador case, of the different kind of environmental conservation private properties, private projects. So we have the habitat banks in Colombia. Colombia was the first country in Latin America that implemented and put in operation a habitat bank. Now we have 14 habitat banks in Colombia. There are looking for habitat banks also in Brazil right now. There are some exercises that are trying to do in Peru, in Mexico. I think I understand that they are also looking for our regulation and how to have an idea how you can implement these mechanisms to get resources and money for environmental compensations and for the voluntary markets. But at the same time, we have the MEX, which is this other kind of methods and tools in order to implement conservation projects. We have the natural reserves that are registered by the government. You have the natural reserves that are not registered by the government, but are registered before us in Resnatur. And you have also natural reserves that are not registered between the government, between Resnatur, between nobody. And there are also some local natural reserves organizations. So at the end, what we're seeking and what we think is that if you want, and we have countries like Peru, like Ecuador, like Colombia, we are in the tropic and we have different kind of ecosystems. You need to connect everything because everything is part of the national ecosystem. No matter you can have moorland projects and humid forests and dry forests and different kind of ecosystem, but at the end there must be a national policy that interconnects and makes a connection between the efforts of the private society, but also in connection with the efforts of the national government, because national government is also working on biodiversity. For instance, now we have 54 national parks, there are local parks, there are different kind of protected areas in Colombia. So what we need is to advance and to have a better coordination between the different stakeholders, so we can make the best with the less efforts that we have, and also with the minimum resources that we have, because at the end, when we are talking about private properties of my owners that they want to preserve and to protect the environment, the problem always will be the money. You can have the interest, but at the end, if you have to pay taxes, you have to find somewhere else how to manage and to do what you have to do in order to implement your environmental management plans of your single projects. And finally, there is a challenge that we have seen is that people that is making conservation and their owners, private properties or public properties or collective properties owned by indigenous communities or by Afro-Colombians that are organized as their own rules. At the end of the day, they are putting all the efforts, and there are a lot of people that we can call free riders that are having all of these positive impacts from the conservation, but there are no putting any effort in order to help people to protect. So there is a conflict, and we have to solve that problem, and it's how to make a rule by which people that they don't have the property, but they are using the natural and the ecosystem services that are part and that are caused by the protected areas. So there is a conversation that what we have to look at in order to make a decision that can have some justice for private properties. So this is like a general overview of what we have seen and what we think is the main challenges that we are having right now in private conservation projects in our country.
Thank you, Eduardo, for that interesting presentation. Our final guest is Anne McInerney. She's the Senior Program Officer at the Alumbre Innovations Foundation located in Baja California Sur in Mexico. She's a successful executive leading a cross-cutting impact team focused in Latin America and the Caribbean, has 25 years of experience and in integrated conservation and community development. And you have the floor.
Thank you. I just want to check and make sure you can hear me.
Yes, very well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Hernan, and thank you, Zach, for having me today. As Hernan mentioned, I'm a Senior Program Officer at Alumbra Innovations Foundation. And we are, if you go to the next slide, Robin. We are a collective of businesses, organizations, and lands that are working toward a world in which community, environment, and economy function as an integrated system for well-being. We own over 17,000 hectares here in Baja California Sur, and that's made us keenly interested in the voluntary conservation possibilities in our region. Personally, I've been working in private land conservation my entire career and have been working primarily in Northwest Mexico over the past 20 years. I do not pretend to be an expert on the national scale of Mexico. And so I'll be speaking mainly about my experiences here and with some sort of thinking more higher level about what we can do together in Mexico and northern Mexico. Next slide. So just to set the context for Mexico, we're a mega diverse country, as Ecuador and Colombia both are as well. The challenge with Mexico is that it's so incredibly large, and what works in one place and one part of the country may not work in any other part of the country. We are not only challenged with protected areas and a protected area network, which is shown here on this map, that is land-based, but it's also marine-based. Over 50% of the land in Mexico is in private hands, and only 11% of the country is in protected areas. And that includes all the private reserves that are registered within the system. But I would like to say that we do have a strong legal framework for voluntary private land conservation and an excellent lead organization in Fondo Mexicano para la Conservación de Naturaleza, who does a lot of work on regulatory and legal updates through the Congress, and also very strong environmental legal organizations that support the judicial process and pushing things through that actually can have judicial precedent as well as the legislative and legal support. Next slide. So these are some of the private conservation tools that we have in Mexico. The ones that I'm most familiar with, I put at the top. The ecological servidumbre ecológico, which is a conservation easement, just between two pieces of land. And we've put that to work, not as the foundation, but within a large ejido, Ejido Luisa Echeverria Alvarez, that put 120,000 acres into a conservation easement in their communal, with conservation zoning intact, to protect a whale sanctuary that's actually inside of a biosphere reserve. So one thing that I'd like to mention is that all of these private land conservation tools, we often layer them on top of each other to ensure that if one instrument fails, the next instrument actually might be able to keep a property in conservation. We do have the Derecho Real de Conservación, which is fairly new in Mexico and is being implemented at the state level in Sonora. We have conservation contracts, which are contracts mainly between private nonprofits and landowners. And the difference between that and a conservation easement is that the conservation easement is designed to be in perpetuity. It has not been tested at that scale, as many of them have not. Clearly, we haven't reached places where we're not deep enough or long enough into these instruments to be able to test them at that scale. But a conservation contract can be validated through the civil system, the civil judicial system in Mexico, which honors contracts up to 99 years, which is the same length of time that a fideicomiso or a land contract is available to a private owner. So we feel like that's a pretty secure instrument for being able to tie specific land uses and specific activities to a landowner and that are validated and monitored by an outside party. I feel like we have a very strong system within the Mexican government. The two or three that are four next on here are all public instruments that encourage private land conservation or voluntary private land conservation. Payment for ecosystem services are available to communally owned landowners as well as private landowners through the CONAFOR, the forestry ministry in Mexico. And those are based on water, biodiversity, and other types of ecosystem services. And Unidad de Manejo Ambiental is actually related to an economic use. So for example, in our region in Baja California Sur, we have 10 ejidos that have joined together to put 2 million hectares into an UMA to manage the area of bighorn sheep. And that is supported by the government. It's registered with the government. Those areas are managed for that endangered species, and that allows them to sell hunting permits for those animals that are constantly censused and managed appropriately and evaluated, so that when those hunting permits are sold, those funds go back to the ejidos, and that pays for continued land management. We have the areas destined for voluntary conservation, which are the private reserves. There are almost 600 of those in the country, mainly in the southern part of Mexico. Over 1 million hectares are preserved, only representing 5% of the total land area, or the total percentage of areas that are protected in the country. And then two last ones that I want to touch on. Mexico has a huge amount of coastline, and there's a lot of pressure on our coastline for development, for tourism, for other kinds of industrial uses. And Fondo Mexicano has been very effective at being able to work with this federal agency, which is that manages the federal maritime zone, to put conservation concessions as part of the coastal zone management scheme. So a conservation entity can actually apply for a concession for conservation along the coastline. And that's been done in many, many cases, paired with private lands that are conserved, as well as marine protected areas, to ensure that there's no open potential for development between a land-based preserve or a marine-based preserve. So we have continuity and corridors that go from the landscape all the way to the sea. And then finally, we just have a tremendous amount of private landowner initiative. Most recently, there's been a lot of interest in the voluntary carbon market and what those financial incentives might look like. And I'll talk a little bit about that a little later. Can we go to the next slide, Robin? So I want to focus on how we're actually financing this work, and if there are incentives for this work to occur. This map is a partnership between Fondo Mexicano and Fundación Gonzalo Rio Ronte in Mexico. It's two private Mexican foundations that are working together to create water funds, to create conservation projects that support ecosystem services, and to encourage other private entities to finance those. Philanthropic funding has been very successful in the region for private land conservation, and we've been very lucky in Northwest Mexico to receive a lot of support for acquisition and for conservation easements along coastal zones, as well as large private landscapes. Water and environmental funds, as you can see, are prevalent. There aren't as many in northern Mexico, and that's something that our foundation is going to be focusing on in the next 5 to 10 years. I've already mentioned some of the government programs that are financing this work, and we're lucky to have large manufacturing and industrial corporate actors that feel a strong sense of social responsibility and are primarily using the water and environmental funds as their conduit for financing large conservation efforts. And then finally, I'll say private landowners are doing this as a labor of love, that they're doing it with their own funds from their own pocket with very little support from government or from outside actors once the initial purchase is done. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, you can look at Mexico and its level of human footprint and ecosystem integrity and see that northern Mexico has significant integrity of its ecosystems and very few people. That gives us a lot of potential to do more work in northern Mexico than has typically been done. I think it's a huge area of opportunity for the country, and it prompted our foundation to invest in a study of private landowners in 2022 to actually look at what the opportunities were to form alliances and networks in this region to capitalize on what private landowners were doing, both nonprofit private landowners and large individual private landowners. We interviewed 22 landowners that are managing lands for conservation in northern Mexico with two purposes: to understand their shared challenges for managing their private lands, and also how can we strengthen these conservation areas and in some cases even restore them. For example, in our state, I'm based in La Paz, Baja California Sur in Mexico. Almost 500,000 hectares of ejido land has been parcelized with the intention to sell it and then develop it either for residential or for coastal tourism. That's 10% of our ejido land that's held communally in our state. So and more is coming down the pike. So we feel a strong pressure to address what private land conservation can look like and to put additional protections into these landscapes that can be enforced. Next slide, please. So what were those findings? That land tenure issues, boundary irregularities, and settlement incursions are where landowners are spending most of their time and money. That we have very little baseline information. And I can just say that one quote from a landowner that came from the interviews was, "Why would I take a photo of something so ugly?" They're not starting from beautiful landscapes. They're starting often from degraded landscapes and building them back up. The photo that you see here is from our own property where we have put a fence in, and this is only 2 years of fencing that you can see clearly that the vegetation is recovering quite nicely on the right, and on the left is continues to degrade from overgrazing. Ongoing monitoring is also very rare. Private landowners do not have the funding for long-term management and restoration. One of the findings from the study was that when all of us are very excited about purchasing a piece of land, we focus only on the acquisition and we don't focus on the long-term management and stewardship needs. And I'll focus on the third point here. Right now, in our region of Northwest Mexico, we're seeing incredible pressure on the landscape from grazing that forces us to go beyond conservation and management to restoration, which also has a high cost and something that we need to really look at over the next few years. Next slide. So challenges and opportunities. Unfortunately, the funding from our public sector in Mexico continues to decline. Our public agencies are losing financing, they're losing staff, and we're losing enforcement and surveillance as a result of that. Land tenure is often a barrier to entry for a lot of the financing schemes that are available to long-term residents. For example, in our region, we have land titles that come from 1910 directly and these properties are owned communally by large family units. And it's very difficult for them to produce an updated land title. And then unfortunately, we have some resistance to solutions from private investment, either philanthropic or corporate. Locally, there's a lot of suspicion on why someone would want to exploit our natural resources. And nationally, it's just not in the public dialogue politically to allow private actors to seek out public-private partnerships at this point. So we continue along on our own, with voluntary carbon market being a nice potential option for private landowners, and that there's new multilateral financing streams related to climate change. And luckily, we have strong and national and regional leadership in our nonprofit sector. And I will just close with this beautiful image. Next slide. From the Aurora Borealis that took place last week here in our region. And I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you today.
Hernan, you're muted.
Yeah, okay, there you go. I was clicking the wrong button. Well, thank you, Anne. I will pass the floor to Zach Hamel, who is a graduate student from the University of Montana and has been working this past year on strengthening the network in private protected areas in Latin America and doing a research thesis on that subject. Zach, so you have the floor and to address the questions and answers section.
Great, thank you, Hernan. And thank you, panelists, for some really great presentations. It's really great to have some representation from a few different countries in this webinar series. And I'll jump right into it. And Anne, I'm going to start with you just because of your most recent presentation. And it seemed like towards the beginning of your presentation, you were talking a little bit about the issue of perpetuity or permanence, maybe, of conservation designations. And it'd be interesting if you could expand or maybe elaborate on what's the balance between a designation that you're wanting to have, a long-term effect for conservation, but at the same time balancing, rural livelihoods. Do you see how is your organization's approaches to private lands conservation compatible with rural livelihoods?
Thanks, Zach. Actually, I'm not sure that we're really doing conservation as it's traditionally described anymore here. We are really looking more toward restoration, and restoration for the purpose of returning lands to productive use. Clearly, there's need for zoning and planning so that we can maintain core areas. And we have, in my state of Baja California Sur, over 50% of the landscape is already in some kind of protected status. So when we're looking for private lands, in addition to that, we're actually trying to get them back to the place where they can be returned to some kind of use, mainly for grazing. We have on our own properties 14-year fenced areas that we've recently regrazed that have gone straight back to being totally denuded from animals. So we're still trying to work out how long exactly this landscape takes to recover, and what is it going to take for rural livelihoods to be, they're continue to be dominant on the landscape, but in harmony with what the land needs are to maintain its ecosystem services.
Mm-hmm. And do you see opportunities for involving more ranchers or maybe farmers in some of your programs or maybe other approaches to private lands conservation?
I mean, we would love to involve as many neighbors, small producers, agricultural producers, and ranchers as we possibly can. But the land tenure issue remains a very big barrier, and we're still trying to resolve how we can certify that these properties are owned long-term by families and maintained by them, stewarded by them, and managed by them for their use, and with potential to have some kind of conservation activity embedded into their management system. But right now, the current system globally doesn't really support that yet. So we're trying to be creative and hoping that we can, as a foundation, that we can help try to resolve some of those issues in our region.
Great, thank you. And on that issue of land tenure, actually, I've been having several conversations about the possibility of OECMs in maybe being a tool that could address some land tenure issues. And Eduardo, I'm going to turn to you because you mentioned OECMs, or OMEC is the abbreviation for the Spanish term. You mentioned that OMECs are increasingly, the designation is increasingly looked at in Colombia as a tool that's being used as having potential. I know that Colombia is a huge leader in advancing the possibility of OMECs. Could you maybe share on why there is so much interest in Colombia and why there's been so much progress made in OMECs, and as opposed to maybe or complementing the other PPA designation in Colombia, the Reserva Natural de la Sociedad Civil?
Yes, Zach. This is a brand new tool, so when something is new, it's also part of the of explain why we are having different OMECs. Resnatur has been a key stakeholder helping the OMECs to be part of our current system. One of the main things that it makes a huge difference and why people may go through the OMEC way is that if you want to register a natural reserve of the civil society before the government, you have to be the owner of the property. In the OMEC, you don't have to be the owner. So that's make a huge difference. That's one thing. The other thing is, even though you can be a owner of the private property, we have several problems with the areas and the limits of the properties in Colombia. So you buy a piece of land, this land, you sign a public deed, and it says that is 100 hectares. But when you go to field, it's more than 100 hectares. So if you want to go to the government to register this area, they say, no, notwithstanding that you are governing 200 hectares, I'm only going to register 100 hectares because this is what is written in the paper, and they're not looking for what is happening in the land. So in the case of the OMEC, you don't have to be the owner, and you can make that the OMEC is going to be the whole piece of land and not only what is written in the paper.
And by not being the owner, you mean you have to show proof of land title?
Yes, but when you are not the owner, you can be just like a poseedor, like a possession that you don't have the title, but you have been living there and working that land for more than 10 years.
Yeah. Thank you, Eduardo. Mark, I'm going to stick on the topic of legal frameworks, and I'm going to ask you about I'm going to ask you to elaborate a little bit about the kind of land trust and conservation easements that you mentioned in Ecuador. Why did you mention that as having potential there, and maybe what would be some of the next steps in helping advance the utility of that tool?
Okay, well, I mean, there's a legal framework for Sociobosque, which is probably the largest program, and they'll pay between, say, $5 and $30 per hectare, per year, depending on how much land you have. So the larger land holdings receive a lower fee per hectare. And so that a lot of people signed up for that. Unfortunately, the program is underfunded. And so people who have pieces of land in that system are not receiving the financial benefits. And so that's a matter of the legal framework is there, but they're not receiving the benefits. There's a fair amount of pushback at this point for people who are in that system, to enter into the carbon and ecoservice services market because they feel they can monetize their conservation commitments better than they can going through a government agency. So it's very much going through this government system, whereas I understand in Colombia and Peru, they have robust markets in carbon trading and ecosystems or other ecosystem services. Other categories like Bosque Protector, you get some tax benefits from that, municipal taxes and things that you get, but there's no direct economic benefit. And then the national, getting into the national system of SNAP, you get theoretically technical assistance from the government, from the Ministry of Environment, and the same group of people that are managing all the national parks and ecological reserves and such. But they're also fairly onerous reporting requirements and management requirements that can kind of offset that. I think that's why there have been so few conservation projects that have opted to enter into those areas. The ones that have entered into those areas are areas where you have land tenure issues or you have issues with security, like on the Colombian border with some of the informal groups that are working with drugs and other things on the border, and so that gives them a little bit of protection to be part of the government. So you know, there's a lot of money coming into Ecuador for conservation of land, and very little of it is currently getting to the private landowners. And I would say especially it's important, as we've all mentioned, some of these smaller landowners they're doing it out of goodwill, and they may not have a very good income, and it might be an individual in the family. And once that person is not involved in that as they get older, then the project, we've seen projects kind of fall apart. And so we would like to see more support from the government on these voluntary efforts.
Thanks, Mark. I want to highlight to a few of our panelists that we have questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom panel for you. If you could respond to a few of those, that would be great. And in the meantime, Mimi, as you well know, the ILCN is very engaged in trying to facilitate and foment connections and networking in PLC partners in various countries across Latin America and really across the whole world. And so these next few questions are going to be geared towards the role that PLC networks play in advancing private lands conservation. And maybe you can speak on a few of the most immediate issues that you see your network as capable of addressing, and maybe what a few specific steps are that your network is taking to move forward in that direction.
Well, it kind of seems like one thing that we're doing now is we're involved in this project for making a database of private reserves and mapping, the Tinker project. And that has engaged a lot more members. We've had a problem with communication over the years. A lot of people are very quiet. But when this mapping opportunity came up, a lot of people chimed in I had never heard from in 26 years. So that was good. It seems like people are going to engage when they feel that there's something moving, when there's some energy going into it. And it's been really good to be able to contact everybody and hear from them. What are they doing? They're looking forward to something moving so that they will be able to protect their land for some time in the future. But we still haven't put together a plan like to deal with this. I've been wanting to do it for years, about the succession of owners. One of our people sold his reserve, but he sold it to somebody who also is going to keep it as a reserve. So that would be something. Being involved with an international organization like ILCN would would make us feel like we are more part of something bigger than ourselves. And as a result, I think there's more interest.
Mhm.
People have sort of a national inferiority complex, whereas if somebody international is interested, they kind of perk up.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. And for one of our viewers in the chat, they were asking what the project was called, and I think it was called the Tinker Project. Is that correct?
It's actually called una iniciativa ciudadana para la conservación de habitat silvestre en Ecuador.
Great. Well, maybe we can share our contact information of our panelists, and if viewers would like to get more, you can reach out directly to Mimi. Eduardo, I'm going to offer a similar question to you. What role is the Resnatur directly playing in addressing all the challenges, or maybe one or two of the challenges that you outlined in your presentation?
There are two main challenges. The first one is these things related with tax matters, not only to the VAT, but also to the property tax. So in that line, we are working on how to manage to draft a project and to present this project to a Congress person in order to promote a change of the law, because it's the only way. Because it's about taxes, then taxes has to be discussed before the National Congress. And the other one is Resnatur is working from two point of view in the coordination and articulation of different things. And the first one is from a technical point of view. Resnatur has been working with helping not only the natural reserves, but also other stakeholders that are wants to promote environmental conservation and biodiversity conservation. So we are focused on technical work, because this is something very important, because you can have resources, but if you don't know how to use that resources and to implement environmental manage action, then you are going to suffer some collateral effects. And the other one is like how to gather together with different people that are interested in the same times, not only from a local point of view between different roles that we have here. Here we have Resnatur as a national association, but inside Resnatur we have a small practice groups of different topics. So that's why that's how we are working. And at the same time, in this kind of webinars and spaces with different people from other countries, and we are very happy that we are part of this event and to attend this event. This is how we are working to make the people talk through Resnatur and how we can promote and improve our actions in territory.
Thank you, Eduardo. And Anne, I'll finish with you before I pass this over to Hernan, because we're already almost at our time. You mentioned that your organization is a large grouping of different NGOs and organizations that are involved in PLC. Where do you see the next steps for strengthening networking in northern Mexico?
That's a really good question. There is a small alliance of nonprofits already working on this, but I think the daily activities and challenges around land management are overwhelming most of the potential partners that could be engaging in a more networked way to promote conservation and restoration in our region. So I think the opportunities are really around understanding the true costs of management and stewardship in the long term, and fully financing that, both from the philanthropic side as well as through the public sector. I do see a lot of potential with the voluntary carbon market for our region and for Mexico, but to my knowledge, there aren't any active networks of groups that are participating in those projects yet. So that may be one place where there's an opportunity to do much more.
Thank you, Anne. And thank you to all our panelists once again. And Hernan, I'll pass it over to you to conclude. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Zach. Well, we have reached the end of our webinar time. We thank the panelists for sharing interesting presentations and insights on the enable conditions in their countries, and to all those of you who connected to this webinar and who contributed with their questions. Stay tuned for future webinars that we are regularly hosting, and I invite you to visit our website at landconservationnetwork.org and remind you that the ILCN is organizing its 4th Global Congress, marking the 10th anniversary of the network. It will take place from October 16 to 18 of this year in Quebec, Canada, under the general theme Relationships for a Resilient World. You can go to the website and find out more information on the Congress. Well, thank you once again to all, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.